Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 2nd of November 2024. Won't be too long this one. Geopolitics is a bit thin on the ground, should we say, on a Saturday afternoon concerning the war in Ukraine. But here we have a French general, saying, this is General Michel Yakovlev, saying, I think that's Yakovlev, saying, right now, no member of the French political class is on awake mode. European society must realise that not only has war returned to the European continent, but that the real target is not only Ukraine, the real target is the whole of Europe. And this can't be emphasised enough. It's not so much that Russia will continue rolling through Ukraine and into Poland and the Baltics, although they are genuinely worried about that. Poland is presently building trench lines and minefields on its Russian border, Belarusian border. But so it's not so much that. I don't know that Russia would be in any way able to do anything like that, given that they've been completely exhausted militarily in this war in Ukraine that they haven't even remotely won or prevailed at. I think the most likely outcome at the moment is a sort of frozen conflict where negotiations will lead to neither side getting what they want. I think that's probably more likely at the moment. Russia are never going to be able to have their maximal objectives achieved, such as having control of the entirety of Ukraine, such as at the beginning of the war when it really was a special military operation. And they wanted to exchange the government for their own puppet government in Kiev, and then basically run Ukraine through a puppet government. That's never going to happen. So what can they achieve? Well, they can't kind of win if that's your sense of winning. That's their sense of winning. They can't win. But by Russia not winning doesn't mean that Ukraine wins. And I think the likelihood is that you get both sides getting a suboptimal end result, although actually Russia still gets to gain a whole bunch of land, Ukrainian land. And so that's why it's so important that we all help Ukraine as much as we possibly can, and we are simply not doing that. But that aside, so I don't think there's this kind of military worry about Russia marching through Europe. They just get absolutely hammered at the western Ukrainian border if that was ever remotely the case. But they are fighting against Europe. This is a political battle against Europe. Europe, the EU, more accurately, is Russia's main enemy. I don't think it's the US. I think it's the EU, because the EU is the closest, geographically speaking, entity that has traditionally been or has a potential to hold Russia to account. And Putin hates that united Europe, the organization, the ideology, as a dictator wanting to do what he wants, having as neighbours a free and fair electoral democratic union. I think that is infuriating for him, and so that's why he's been trying so hard to disunite Europe. That's why he was meddling with Brexit. That's why he's supporting AfD and Vox and Rassemblement National, and all of the groups around Europe, all the political parties around Europe who are anti-EU. He is behind them all. So I think this guy's absolutely right. European society must realise that not only has war returned to the European continent, but the real target is the whole of Europe. But I would say much more in a kind of political, informational, cyber kind of domain. Now, we're going to step sideways here a little bit to go to Russia itself and talk about their problems that they might be facing they are facing at the moment. There are some huge threads by Prune 60 about the railway situation, and by extension all these other areas like coal production, chemicals production, grain production, all of it looking a bit problematic for Russia, and then also reflected in low loading on the railway network for those goods, and then the railway network being in a lot of trouble, and all of that kind of stuff. And then a load of other different threads from Prune 61. Prune 61 was about about how the National Wealth Fund is looking at trying to make something more liquid in terms of cash. One of its entities, they might try and privatize to generate some cash and so on and so forth. The idea being that things are a bit desperate behind the scenes is, I think, what we can draw from this. Anyway, Prune 60 here says, Russia, quote, Deputy Prime Minister Patrushev orders measures to be taken within 2 weeks to maintain food prices. So this could be a bit of an issue. Deputy Prime Minister Patrushev orders measures to be taken within 2 weeks to maintain food prices. Held a meeting Thursday, following which he instructed departments to take those measures within 2 weeks. Quote, following the meeting, Deputy Prime Minister instructed to monitor the food market on a daily basis and the interested departments to take comprehensive measures within 2 weeks to maintain a stable situation on the food market. We've already seen issues with eggs. We've seen issues more lately with butter. These are all indicators that you've got huge inflation and you've got serious problems going on. Obviously, the labour shortage caused directly by the war, in terms of taking people to the war, killing them in Ukraine, or turning them into people with physical or mental impairments. We have an awful lot of people going back to Russia who are unable to work. And then you've had people running away to other countries, that huge exodus, so on and so forth. And they need these workers, and these workers are in short supply. So you are fighting over them, which means you are trying to attract them with higher and higher wages, and those higher and higher wages, and that includes with the armed forces as well, because the armed forces, you have to attract people to the army rather than any other sector. So you've got to give them even higher wages, and then all the compensation for the cost of the war essentially is insane for Russia. But all of this has an inflationary effect on the Russian economy. To try and deal with that, you've got to put up interest rates to make people more inclined to save rather than borrow. That keeps borrowing down, which is trying to dampen the economy. But it's not like the economy is not overheating because everyone's got, well, I mean, there are people with more money because the wages have gone up, but there are also issues with the production of goods and the import of goods, because you can't get certain goods, or there are tariffs being put, so on and so forth. It's just an absolute economic, I think, chaos. And part of the effect, it appears, is the rising price of food, and it's not looking good. And in fact, the Russian central bank chief has said 21% interest. So the interest rate's gone up to 21%, and she said, what were the words? There is no upper rate to where this might go. Something like that. Basically, you can expect interest rates to continue to rise in December. I mean, they're already at 21%. This is worse than you might think. So everything is going to plan, says OSINT Yuri Kikaski. Russia's central bank may raise its lending rate from 21% to 23%, so even more, meaning the average Russian mortgage will be about 25%. The lending rate in the UK is about 5%, in Germany 5.85%, in the US 4.83%. Putin, of course, remains a master strategist. And as Artur Rehi says, the Central Bank of Russia has raised the key interest rate to 21%. It's very difficult to run a profitable business with such a key rate. Production, except for the military industry, is stagnating. The military industry has also reached a plateau, and Russia cannot increase production. Even Nabiullina, so she's, I think, in charge of the bank, and Sergei Chemezov argue about who is to blame. Clouds are gathering over Nabiullina, and she will most likely be fired in the near future. The next increase in the key rate should be expected before the end of the year. The Russian economy is cracking and regulatory pressures are not working. The central bank hopes to scare people away from new loans with a high rate, but this is not helping. People are rushing to get loans as soon as possible in anticipation of the rate going up even more. Due to the increase in rates, expenses on mortgage subsidies and servicing of the national debt have increased. Budget expenditures are growing. Inflation cannot be contained. And prices are rising. So I showed you that video of someone nicking 25 blocks of butter at knife point from a shop, and now butter is in a lot of shops under those in cases with alarms on and whatnot, like you might get with a very expensive alcohol or whatever. Anyway, Artur Rehi concludes enterprises are closing due to low profitability. The only way out for Russia is to leave Ukraine, and even after that, it will take years for the economy to recover. So, like I said before, this will be seen, I think, in history as the worst decision of a leader in the modern era. In terms of invading Ukraine, it's just shot the Russians in the foot in terms of demographics, in terms of brain drain, in terms of their military-industrial complex being shafted, in terms of their economy, in terms of their welfare state being underfunded because every penny is going towards the war, and by welfare state, that's education, healthcare, etc., etc., etc. This is an absolute disaster for Russia. It really, really is. But of course, the sunk cost fallacy means that, well, if you admit it's a disaster, what you should do, rationally speaking, is get out of Ukraine right now. Tomorrow, pull all the troops out of Ukraine. Say, sorry about that. Really, really sorry. Please, can we come back onto the international scene? Please, can we not be a pariah state? I'm really sorry. Let's all be very nice to each other. And all that money that we're spending on the army, let's actually start spending that on the people of Russia. That's the best thing you could do. Cut your losses. But of course, he can't do that. That would be political suicide for him, whether in reality or perception. And so therefore, he would just keep perpetuating this war on account of the sunk cost fallacy, which is I put all this effort and money into it. I can't pull out now because that means that's all gone to waste. So I'm going to put even more money into it, but then that will be wasted in chasing, good money with bad or bad money with good, whatever. It's a nightmare for Russia, and there are so many kind of subtle indicators that things aren't going well. You see this a lot. So I've seen videos of new Scooby-Doo vans, new Bukanka vans that have been created, and you look at them and the people going around it going, the seals on this are terrible. It's like, this is rubbish. People looking at new Lada cars and saying, this is just the worst car ever. This woman inside looking at this Lada car, this new Lada Niva, going...
Смотрите, Lada.
And then looking at the computer system on board, the onboard computer there, and then reading through it and saying, none of this makes sense. And the only way I can explain this type thing, I'm paraphrasing here, is that it's been sort of translated from from Chinese. Because, what does this all mean? And the idea is that the cars aren't even being made in Russia, they're being made in China, or at least large parts of them are. This has been actually said by one of the economy ministers when he went round an exhibition about 6 months ago. I think there was a hint that came out there that all their cars are getting made in China. So, economically speaking, and politically, actually, Russia has become this vassal state of China, where they are dependent so much on China because no one's buying their stuff. They're the pariah state internationally. They're getting sanctioned. Everything's going, Pete Tong, everything's going wrong inside Russia. And they are more and more dependent on their neighbours, China. So Prune 60 here saying the State Duma has developed a bill to introduce duties on Apple equipment, as in the company, Apple. It's going to make things even more expensive. So, they've already put $2 undecillion dollar fine on Google, which is more money than the entire world has. So Google's probably going to pull out. That's Google done for them. Apple, the way that Russia is, I'd say the way it's interacting is going to continue to shrink from global society and not be interacting with global society. People will not be able to access Apple and Google, etc., etc. And more, if they want stuff, they'll have to go to China. And we have already seen a huge number of Chinese cars are in Russia as European and American cars have pulled out of Russia. It's that dependence on China. But really interesting there. Anyway, moving away from that, there'll be much more as the weeks and months go by in terms of Russia's economic situation. I think it is in a very vulnerable place at the moment. Now, during a visit to China, Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico blamed the West, of course he did, for Russia's invasion of Ukraine and praised China's peacemaking efforts. Of course he did. Saying continued Western support prevents peace. Of course it does. Fico criticised the EU's military stance and claimed that early 2022 peace deals were blocked by Western leaders, accusing Ukraine's leadership of pursuing a victory plan instead. Of course, says nothing of Russia invading Ukraine. Like, who should we look at for moral culpability for this war? Oh yeah, the West. America. Europe. frickin' Putin, mate. Look no further. Anyway, now the FBI has announced another Russian disinformation operation seeking to gain support for Trump. This is completely unsurprising. The FBI and National Intelligence Agencies have just confirmed that the video shared by MAGA voters on Twitter claiming that Haitians are voting in Georgia was produced by the Russians. I had mentioned this previously. Here is a full statement. Quote, the IC, international community, assesses the Russian influence actors manufactured a recent video that falsely depicted individuals claiming to be from Haiti and voting illegally in multiple counties in Georgia. So on and so forth. I mean, the FBI coming out and saying this video basically came from Russia. FBI and a bunch of other agencies, actually, the ODNI and CISA, produce a statement together. Just be warned, there is so much Russian disinformation going out there. It's very much a problem for the international community actually going forward. Now, Trump would not lift a finger to help Ukraine fend off Russia's genocidal invasion, says Julia Davis. He is saying it loud and clear. So this is Trump at a recent rally.
Stupidity. They got us into Ukraine. We should have never gone into Ukraine. If I was president, you would have never gone into Ukraine. This is not a charity event. This is an election for the biggest and toughest job in human history. This is the person.
Okay, I've said this umpteen times before, but I'm just going to pick up on the first point. Well, Michael McFaul, the previous ambassador to Russia, or a previous ambassador to Russia, says, no American president has ever talked like this. Trump is so wrong on this. This approach to foreign policy will deeply damage American security interests. And of course, Trump said, sorry, that one's to come. It's this one. And Michael McFaul, again, says, can someone on the Trump team tell him that the United States did not go into Ukraine? So Trump here talking about, we should never have gone into Ukraine. You haven't gone into Ukraine. Then he talks in terms of it being a charity. Like, this isn't, like, as I keep saying to you, time and time again, and this shows a gross misunderstanding of the entire process, the entire geopolitical landscape. And it shows that he's actually deeply unqualified to become president, because this is nothing to do with charity. This is in the strategic interest of the US. The US would not be putting any money into Ukraine if it wasn't strategically necessary for them to do so. Morality plays second fiddle. Like, charity is not a thing. Morality plays second fiddle to strategic interests, which you can argue are a kind of form of moral obligation, right? If you're saying, this is, well, actually, it's interesting because politics is a subset of morality. Morality is kind of three different ways to understand morality. There's descriptive morality, which is what people actually do, morally speaking. It's like, these people do this, these people do that. Let's describe their morality. There's prescriptive morality, which is what people should do, kind of normative morality. You should do that in a given situation. And then there's meta-ethics, which is kind of what does right mean, what does wrong mean, and what does moral obligation mean. So they're kind of looking at the terms. So that second one, moral obligation or prescriptive morality, normative morality or ethics, is concerned with what people should do. So when you talk about politics, it's like, as a country, we should do this. And as soon as you talk about obligation or should, then we ought to do this. You really talk about morality. So politics is just morality writ large. Normally we talk about morality with regard to individual interactions, but actually politics is societal interactions and what we should do as society. It's just morality writ large and often across the globe and with relationships with other countries. So it's really important that we understand that that's what politics is, but also there is a slight differentiation between strategic objectives, like goal. We can talk about goal-oriented morality, right? Which is where, if I want the world to look like this, then I should do this. Well, actually, that's what international politics is, which is if I want the world to look like this, then we should do this. But sometimes you can kind of distance yourself from like pure morality in terms of making the world look a better place and think more in terms of power for your country. So it might not be that this is the best thing for the whole world, but this is the best thing for the US if we are interested in hard and soft power around the world. And so you set out your diplomatic objectives and foreign policy agenda, and then you go and do X, Y, and Z. Now, you can say that that is a form of morality, goal-orientated behavior and obligations. So there is that. And then there's the idea that, oh, we should help Ukraine right now because I feel sorry for them. They've been invaded by X, Y, and Z. But actually, you can say that for any place on earth. You can say, oh, we should go and give loads of money to this country because actually they're being screwed over. So the Uyghurs in China, or the this there, or the that there, or, you know, I always use the example of Zimbabwe. Why did we do nothing about Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, but we did march into Iraq and we fired missiles in Libya and, you know, Syria and whatever? It's like, okay, they've got a lot of oil. Zimbabwe didn't have a lot of oil, so that's why we choose to be involved in some places but not others. And in which, so that should lead us to realize that international intervention is less about morality on a kind of purely feel sorry for them because there's some moral harm being done, and more about achieving our strategic objectives in terms of keeping trade going and having access to natural resources. And that is more likely what goes on. And the difference with regard to Ukraine is, in my opinion, that morality and strategy aligned perfectly. This is one of these rare occasions where it's not just about doing things to make our nation more powerful and have access to resources and not have them be powerful, and all these different realities as to why we've got involved in Ukraine. But it's also they were invaded by a bunch of horrible people doing horrible things, right? And so there's this perfect alignment of morality and strategy. And that's why it's really easy to make a case for supporting Ukraine, because you can do it on both sides. Whereas, you know, Iraq was kind of a bit funky. Israel, Palestine is much more complex. So on and so forth. And yeah, I just think Ukraine is much, much more obvious. But, you know, we are ostensibly not helping Ukraine because it's charitable to do so. So his finishing here just shows that he doesn't understand why they're involved in. No one's taken the time to explain to Donald Trump why the frick the US is involved in Ukraine. And if it has been explained, he can't retain it. He hasn't retained it.
As president, you would have never gone into Ukraine. This is not a charity event. This is an election for the biggest and toughest job in human history.
He just doesn't really understand. And then it gets even worse. So this is what I almost sidetracked on. So McFaul talks about this. No American president has ever talked like this. Trump is so wrong on this. This approach to foreign policy will deeply damage American security interests.
Because we're being taken advantage of by every country all over the world, including our allies. And in many cases, our allies are worse than our so-called enemies, okay?
That should be freaking headlines right across the American media landscape. That is terrible, and alone that should invalidate him from being voted for by anyone who's interested in foreign policy. So he has just said, one, the enemies are so-called enemies. In other words, they're not really enemies. So he's saying, really, and enemies, that's that's a plural. So I presume he's meaning Russia and Iran, North Korea, and China. I can't think of anyone else he'd mean in that context. So it's like, these are not really enemies, first of all. So Russia's not really an enemy. Second of all, our allies are worse than those. So who are allies? Well, Germany, France, UK, Europe in general. He's literally said, we European nations are worse than Russia. And you want to vote for that man. You want to vote for him. He doesn't know how to do politics. He is appealing to the support of dictators, of Viktor Orban, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, who's said all lovely things to, and he's never said nice things about democratically elected leaders that I've heard. And now he's saying, and those democratic nations who are supposedly our allies are worse than our so-called enemies. They're more enemy than our enemies. I don't know what you do with that. Well, I do. Sorry. I know clearly what you do with that. You don't vote for him. You don't vote for someone who says that. So I would like you below in the thread, please, if you are still a supporter of Donald Trump, how do you explain saying this at a campaign rally when you are trying to be the leader of the nation who will be interacting with all of those allies? How do you explain these remarks?
Because we're being taken advantage of by every country all over the world, including our allies. And in many cases, our allies are worse than our so-called enemies, okay?
So in many cases, our allies are worse than our so-called enemies. So in many cases, European nations are worse than Russia. That's what that means. Explain that to me, please, in a way that makes me want to vote for Trump. Sorry, this keeps coming up because we are very close to the election. So that's why I'm keeping on talking about him, because he keeps saying things pertaining to Ukraine and Russia.